can you really give them an equal vote to somebody who comes from a good family with good education and good money? It's not the same. Well, one of the keys to making this experiment work in America was women. Because who was going to raise that regular guy to be a good citizen, to make good decisions that were good for everybody, let's say in his community, or maybe even in his county, or ideally in his whole state? You know, maybe he didn't have a lot of money, maybe he didn't have a lot of education, but hopefully he could be, and the term back then was virtuous and disinterested. And by disinterested, that kind of means not too selfish. Who's going to raise him to be like that? Well, of course, it's the mother. So people talked a lot back then about this concept called Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood. Small r and a small m. Republican motherhood was even sometimes referred to as the fourth branch of government. As we start to evolve our three branches of government, people said, you know, this motherhood thing is really important. And one way that that benefited women, in addition to being told, I guess you have an important role to play in this new republic, another way it benefited women is that it meant that they were going to get a better education. Because people started to say, you know, I guess we need to teach women and girls more than needlepoint and how to play the piano, because on their shoulders rests the next generation of good, virtuous citizens who are going to choose our next leaders, these young boys, and then men. So Republican motherhood's an important concept. All right, and then what about slaves? What would the war mean for slaves? Well, both for white women and for enslaved people, wars often, although are horrific in so many ways, wars present opportunities for both groups. We see over and over again for white women in American history that women get opportunities to do things because of war and because men leaving for war, and they prove themselves. They prove that they can do things that people thought they couldn't do. And then at the end of the war, you can't really take those things back. You can't take those jobs back, those roles back. And so ironically, we see this sort of a weird thing in women's history, but wars are good for women's progress. And wars also in American history have provided opportunities for African Americans, and in the case of wars up and through the Civil War, for enslaved people. And that's certainly true for the Revolutionary War. Of course, it was going to vary depending on what your circumstances were if you were an enslaved person, but there was some opportunity there. And the two things that I'll focus on here is, one, all of this talk about freedom and liberty and justice for all, and certainly the Declaration of Independence at the beginning of the war, did benefit some enslaved people. It's not like you and I see the irony and the disconnect between a war being fought for freedom and keeping people enslaved. We see the irony, and those people just couldn't see it. Actually, they did see it. A lot of them did see it. It's what they did about it that that varied and is, I think, really interesting and sometimes very problematic. Now, if you and I took a field trip to, let's say, Virginia, let's say we went on a class field trip and we went up to the courthouses of Virginia during the time period right after the Revolutionary War, and we started looking through the wills of slaveholders, what we would find is a bubble of manumissions around this time. A manumission is when you write in your will that you want your slaves to be freed when you die as opposed to, going to your children or specifying other people you want to have your slaves. Why all these manumissions? Well, it's because some of these people were moved and affected by all this talk about freedom and liberty, and so they chose to manumit their slaves when they died. Now this bubble ends, it's not a line that goes like this. It's a clear bubble that ends because leaders in Virginia and places nearby realized that they didn't want to keep this up, and so they changed the laws, making it much more difficult to manumit your slaves. So we don't see it happening on and on and on. But a number of slaves did get their freedom during this period because of that. And, one of the men who well, Thomas Jefferson, or at least you've heard of him, he talked pretty openly about this conflict between the things that he was actually writing and the fact that he owned these slaves. And when I see you guys in person, I'll talk more about his relationship with Sally Hemings, who you guys may know that he had a long-term relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. And if you remind me in class, I'll give you the whole backstory on that. But one of the things that Thomas Jefferson said was having slaves and slavery in general was like holding a wolf by the ears. He wanted to let it go, but he thought that if he did, it would kill him. And ultimately, I think, destroy the society is what he thought. So it's a very complicated and troubling topic that we're going to continue to talk about. But getting back to, what did the war mean for enslaved people, I think we can say that a small proportion got their freedom as a result of manumission. We do see this bubble. And some also got their freedom from running away during the chaos of the war. Partly because the British, particularly later in the war years, are going to offer freedom to slaves who are willing to run away from their masters and join the British side. And I'm going to look at that a little bit more when we get into the nuts and bolts of the war, but I think it's important for us to remember that the British aren't doing this, because they have abolition in their heart or the good outcomes in their motivation isn't really the good outcomes for enslaved people. It's because they're trying to beat their enemy, who in this case is the white colonists, and so they're trying to undermine colonial society by offering freedom to slaves. How many slaves are we talking about? How many enslaved people do we think got their freedom? We think about 55,000 slaves fled to freedom during this time. Some of them were able to get away to Canada. Some of them did flee and to the British side, fought for the British, and were awarded their freedom afterwards. So it's a very complicated and difficult time. So there is opportunity, but I don't want to paint it too optimistically either, because it was a very, very difficult time as well. All right, and then final for everyone, but particularly for enslaved people. All right, and then finally, loyalists. I want to talk briefly about loyalists here because I don't want you to have the impression that going into the war or even all the way through the war that all the Americans were in support of this revolution.